Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Sorry, we're learning how to do this technical thing. Parents are going to have to take it over after I'm gone. So, um, hope everyone had a refreshing nap slash swim slash whatever all of you did. I saw some nappers. That's a good thing. um, I think this morning we went over a basic approach to mindfulness of breathing, engaged mindfulness of breathing, and I think now there's a lot to be gained from actually going through how the Buddha laid this out in the Ānāpānasati sutta, the Mindfulness of Breathing sutta, which is Majjhima Nikaya 118, and you guys have the text if you want. So the sutta begins by the Buddha saying that, and I referenced this in the last talk, but there's a sutta where the Buddha asks the monks how they practice mindfulness of breathing, and one monk, well-intentioned monk, chimes in and says, putting aside thoughts of the past and future and greed and distress for the world, I mindfully breathe in and mindfully breathe out. And the Buddha says, yes, that is mindfulness of breathing, Venerable Arita, I don't deny it, but as to how mindfulness of breathing is practiced in full, listen and I will speak. And then he lays out this sutta, the Ānāpānasati sutta. And the sutta begins by the Buddha saying that if one fulfills these steps of breath meditation, then one also fulfills the four foundations of mindfulness. So for those of you who don't know, the four foundations of mindfulness are a seminal teaching in Buddhism. And they're frames of reference which one can use to parse experience and approach it more skillfully in how we look at it. So the first frame of reference is the body. So one remains mindful of the body as a body. And so pain, pleasure, neutral feeling. Mind. So one is aware of the mind sort of state, the mood. So the mind is distracted, contracted, exalted, wide, small, surpassed, unsurpassed. The Buddha goes through a list of different adjectives. And then finally, one is aware of the fourth foundation, which is Dhamma categories, which in the sutta, it's laid out as many different categories, but comparative studies recently have narrowed it down to dividing out the qualities of the mind into the five hindrances, which are the hindrances to calm. So things like sensual desire, ill will, restlessness, and the positive qualities or the awakening factors, which are the seven, what we call bojjhanga. And those are things like mindfulness, rapture, tranquility, calm, equanimity. So the Buddha says that if one fulfills the mindfulness of breathing instructions, then one also brings these four foundations to their culmination. And if one fulfills these four foundations, one brings the seven enlightenment factors to their culmination, which are the sort of essential factors towards awakening. And if one fulfills those seven factors, then one realizes true knowledge and deliverance, which is awakening or enlightenment. And the 16 steps which he goes on to speak to are roughly divided into four tetrads, or groups of four. So you have the first four correspond to the first foundation of mindfulness, or mindfulness of the body. And the second four, or the second tetrad, is mindfulness of feelings. The third is mindfulness of mind. And then the fourth is a different way of analyzing experience in terms of the Dhamma categories they fit in. So the Buddha begins by instructing one to set one's body erect and bring mindfulness to the fore. And then to breathing in long, one knows I breathe in long, breathing out long, one knows I breathe out long. And that's the first step. And then breathing in short, one knows I breathe in short, breathing out short, one knows I breathe out short. So this is where one of the issues with how mindfulness of breathing has been taught in the West is people are told to just bring awareness to the breath and then just let the breath come naturally and be what it's going to be and not control it. But we're, as modern people, neurotic and controlling by nature. We love to control things. And if you come out of a day of working and emailing and then are told to just let your breath gently be, it doesn't usually work. And what happens is the tendency to control goes under the surface and begins to move at a sort of subterranean level. And that's when you can get into a very confused mind state, and things can get tight and knotted up. So if you have this sort of momentum from the day and tendency to control, it's much more useful to work with it consciously until it slows down of its own accord. And so instead of right off the bat being like, I will not control my breath, stop trying to control my breath, and controlling yourself towards not controlling your breath. And I mean, I know I've tied myself up in knots many times through that, or did. To use these first steps of breathing in long and short and knowing that breath length to consciously adjust the breath length to what feels comfortable. So instead of thinking breathing in long and short, one can replace those adjectives with light or heavy, subtle or a bit more refined, and just to use it to really figure out what sort of breathing feels good. So if one is a bit agitated, then giving yourself a long out breath can really help. And then if one is low in energy, then extending the in breath and really making much of the in breath can help. And additionally, if one's noting at this level the length of the breath, it's a very conscious an analyzing of the breath quality, which really anchors the breath. It anchors the mind initially as it enters the meditation. Usually, having come from whatever activity, the mind will be spinning off. And to use this very conscious analysis of the breath anchors it in a really concrete way. If you don't know if your previous breath was long or short, then you know you've wandered. And the this is helpful in that it can begin to kind of calm one down, and also really gives one a very concrete way of coming to a center. The next step is he trains thus: I will breathe in, experiencing the whole body. He trains thus: I will breathe out, experiencing the whole body. And every step from after those first two of breathing in long and short, and I should mention it's interesting that it moves from long to short, because one will find that the breath does begin to shorten as it becomes more shallow or subtle. Not so much shallow, but it'll begin to sort of move much more subtly and become shorter in that way. And the being aware of the whole body, this speaks to what we've called the jhana wars in the West. We don't have much to get kind of like too excited about in the robes, so this is kind of what we, it's a nice like fun term for it, the jhana wars. But it speaks to a real issue, which is that this term whole body became translated about 500 years after the Buddha as, or interpreted as, the whole body of the breath at the nose. And it's because at that time, the uh, main practice was something called kasina meditation, which is where people would stare at a disk of light or color or element until it burnt into their eyes and mind, and then use that as their main object. So that leads to a very one-pointed concentration. People took that paradigm of one-pointed concentration, of narrow awareness, and applied it to the breath, and said that the whole body of the breath meant tracking the entire body of the breath at the nose, all the way in and all the way out. And when the mind is calm, that is really good to do, especially if one maintains a wide field of awareness simultaneously. But what scholarship has revealed more and more, and what most senior teachers in my tradition have been speaking to more and more, is interpreting the whole body just as it naturally would be interpreted, which means the whole body. And so this, at least initially, when our minds are really active. So what this means is, instead of the usual instructions you get or got for the last 30 years in many Vipassana circles of like, just stay right at the tip of the nose, right with your breath, which works for a while, but after a time, I know I felt like I was, slamming my head into a brick wall repeatedly. And if one instead interprets the breath to be not just the sensation of the wind at the nostrils, but rather the subtle energy that courses through the body, like the breath energy, pana in Pali, prana in Sanskrit, chi in Taoist thought, then it allows one to explore the full scope of the body in a really engaged way, and it's really enjoyable, and one can do a lot with it. So that's why when we began the meditation this morning, we divided the body into those three chambers and kind of explored different parts of each chamber before expanding to the whole. And this is important because as Westerners, we tend to, I think Ajahn says, we think of our bodies as things that keep our necks from scraping on the ground. So to reacquaint ourselves with our somatic sense and drop the awareness consciously into the diaphragm and torso from the head, where it usually is essential. Because otherwise, since most of us really do live stuck in our heads, the chance of developing a full-bodied awareness and the sensitivity and resources that come from that is very difficult. So frequently expedient means are helpful in that. So to get the sense of the whole body, one can, do this thing of moving through the body chamber by chamber. One can imagine a jar of butter melting down the head. There are visualizations of sort of visualizing the breath as light streaming through the crown of the head and coursing down through the body. I personally recommend cold showers, but no one takes me up on that almost ever, but they really, really helps. So especially when paired with Qigong. So Qigong is very effective too. And some yoga practitioners will already have found ways to drop their awareness, but these are pretty important for Westerners to find some way to help the awareness drop, because it really does take expedient means for a lot of us. So I just jumped in the river when no one was looking. So it really does help. So when one does this, one begins to expand the awareness to encompass the whole body. But in every one of these steps in the Ānāpānasati sutta, the refrain always starts with, he trains thus, I will breathe in. He trains thus, I will breathe out. And then experiencing the whole body or calming the whole body. But there's always the breath in the background. So through all of these, you always want that sensation in the periphery. The breath should always be there. And that allows the whole process to kind of remain smooth and to move and to nourish itself. But when one is aware of the whole body, then really making that conscious effort to sort of widen awareness at the same time. And as one does that, one will find a few things. One is that one will see that, or might see, that the one is trying to breathe in a very, the usual motions our body has to make to breathe, like pumping the lungs in and out very coarsely. When the breath becomes more subtle, then one finds that it's not actually necessary to do this. So the breath will become subtler and shallower. And then one can kind of see where one is squeezing and expanding the body to breathe, and just let those relax a little. And more just sort of trust this energy to move naturally. And really finding where one is sort of moving the body, like the lungs, and just letting that relax. And usually the subtle energy will move around these sort of meridians, so up the spine and down the front of the body in a circuit, or up the front of the body and down the spine, depending. And the fourth step is that one trains thus: I will breathe in, calming the bodily formations. I will breathe out, calming the bodily formations. So this is, or can be interpreted as, the step of those bodily movements. Formations in this case might be best translated as activity. So that sort of bodily movement of, say, expanding and contracting the lungs, or whatever it is, just really letting those calm and just letting the body become more and more still. And similarly, as one grows calm and begins to feel this energy sort of flowing, one might notice certain knots in the body, say at the throat or in the belly, with which might be associated with fear or hunger. And letting those relax and calm is what will let this sort of subtle energy flow much more freely up and down the body. And Bhante Analayo compares the first steps of this tetrad, the first two of breathing in and out, long and short, to a condor flapping to get off the ground. But then these latter two steps are much closer to the condor beginning just to soar without moving its wings. And you'll feel that is that you are trying to maintain this wide awareness of the body, but at the same time, keep an awareness right on the sort of subtle thread of the breath at the nose, or at another point that you feel it very prominently. And both of those are very continuous sensations. So instead of it being in and out, suddenly it's either a very smooth sensation of the breath energy flowing, or it's a very smooth and continuous sensation of the subtle breath at the nose without any break between the inhalation and the exhalation. And so it becomes continuous. And if one gets lost during these steps, it's good to remember you can always come back to noting the breath length. Just bring yourself back to that. And to, if one's directing oneself with the mind, directed thought and evaluation, then one can use questions to do that. So instead of as Westerners, sort of telling ourselves to do something like be with the breath, we're so overbearing by nature that it comes across as far too harsh. So asking a question of oneself, like, can I remain with the breath here? It can be a lot gentler, and the heart and the body will respond naturally to that. And the image the Buddha gives for the first jhana, which is a state of concentration, but it seems to speak, at least in some respect, to the experience of this first tetrad, these first 4 steps, is, he says, just as a bathman's apprentice would take a ball of bath powder and knead water into it so that no part of that ball of bath powder was unpervaded with that water, just so one fills and pervades the body with the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, so that no part of the body is unpervaded with that rapture. So what this can speak to is, during this initial 4 steps, one can really be using these visualizations of, say, the breath as mist, white mist coming in and out, or white light streaming down through the crown of the head and down one leg, down the other leg, down through the crown of the head and out the arms. But the point is that you're sort of massaging the breath energy into all these places which have been so hungry for it for so long. And it nourishes it over time. Which leads us to the next step, which is the 5th. And it says, one trains thus: I will breathe in sensitive to rapture, and I will breathe out sensitive to rapture. So this word rapture is, in Pali, it's translated as, the word is piti, P-I-T-I. And it's been translated as rapture, but I think a better translation might be refreshment. Because it's etymologically related to the word for drink. And it's this real sense of, as that breath energy begins to flow up the meridian and down the meridians, it nourishes one. And there's this real sense of being nourished and soaking it up. And so often we have no idea how starved we've been for that breath energy. Parts of our bodies have just been completely cut off for ages and years, whether because of trauma or just the trauma of sort of modern life, which is pretty much us living up here. There's a great line from the Dubliners that Ajahn Amaro quotes a lot, where he says, Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from himself, viewing his actions and thoughts with mild suspicion, I think, or no, suspicious sidelong glances. And I think that's how a lot of us live. And so the idea is that you as one becomes sensitive to this refreshment flowing through the body, this is the bathman kneading the water into that ball of bath powder, which is what in the Buddha's time people used as soap. It's sort of like how we would knead water into flour to make dough. And so this means that the mind is actually pretty active at this point. Like, the hands are directed thought and evaluation, which in Buddhist terminology is sort of these applied perceptions. So say these visualizations, or asking oneself, can I be aware of the whole breath or the breath here? Like, this is an applied perception, and it's the hands of the bathman's apprentice. So you need this refreshment into the body. And it's compared in the rapture is compared in the commentaries to coming across an oasis after stumbling through the desert for days. And that initial drink, right when you begin to drink, that's the rapture. And the rapture is followed by pleasure, which is the next step. So one breathes in sensitive to pleasure, or sukha, and one breathes out sensitive to pleasure, sukha. So rapture is, or piti, refreshment, it's what we call a sankhara, which means it is tied up with intention, and it means it moves, it's dynamic. So this is that sense of movement, it's sort of soaking through the body. Pleasure, sukha, is a feeling, vedana in Pali, which means it's still, it has no movement. And so the idea is that in the commentaries, it's compared to after you've taken that first drink, it's sort of just after you've begun to sort of drink it and be pretty satiated, but continuing to drink. So this would be when the ball of bath powder is completely pervaded. And it's as if the body is soaked in all of this rapture. And now it just, you feel full. And that movement kind of slows because all these parts of the body that have been so starved have been nourished for a time. The analogy the Buddha gives for the second jhana, which once again doesn't perfectly correspond to this, but I find it kind of speaks to the experience perhaps, is of a lake with no inflows to the north, south, east, and west, but fed by occasional showers from above and showers from below, or in a spring from below, so that no part of the lake was unpervaded with cool water. Just so one pervades the body with the rapture and pleasure born of composure. So that sense of the spring of water, I find that is related to this sensation of rapture or refreshment, breath energy sort of rising naturally, and it begins to flow very naturally. And then the next analogy is of a pond of cool lotuses, resting in cool water so that they're completely immersed from their roots to their tips. And in that analogy, you'll notice that the sense of motion that the previous analogy has. So the first analogy, the bathman's apprentice, there's motion, but it's very active. The hands are acting. In the next one, it's a natural motion. Just the spring is welling up naturally. And that's when, you're maintaining awareness of the breath. You've calmed down the breath quite a lot, and you have this full-bodied awareness. And this breath energy is flowing fluidly without you having to do much. And then this third analogy speaks perhaps to that experience of the body's been pervaded and things are just resting completely still. But there's this sense of pleasure in the body. So in each of these, it can be, the Buddha sort of speaks to, actually, I find a good way to think about that step, but from rapture to pleasure. It's as if this breath energy is circulating around the body like an electric circuit. And what happens with an electric circuit like that is you get a still magnetic field that is an emergent quality. And similarly, that sort of pleasure might be looked at a little bit as this sort of emergent stillness that comes out of that motion after a while. And soon that becomes brighter and brighter. And this can be where a what we call a nimitta of light appears for a lot of people, which is the field of vision becomes brighter and very pervaded with light. And one can miss it at first because frequently for a lot of people, it doesn't appear as sort of a ball of light. It's just a brightening of the whole visual field. And this is really common. Ajahn Fuang, Ajahn Jeff's teacher, would refer to it as the light of the breath. And if that does emerge, then one can treat it as they would the pleasure or the rapture, in that it becomes a focus of awareness, but always in tandem with the breath. And in each of these steps, the breath is always there in the background. If one has been cultivating the sound of silence, which is this sort of subtle hissing in the ears or ringing that's always there, then that can become really prominent at this point. if one hasn't used the sound of silence, then it's worth a try. Ajahn Sumedho discovered it when he went to Europe, and he'd lived in Thailand for about 10 years. And in Thailand, things are always noisy. There's always bugs and like birds and dogs. And so he went to England, and it was just quiet. And he heard this like subtle ringing in his ears, and he took it as his main object, and has taught it since quite frequently. And it's a really powerful object. It's can keep you, especially when paired with the breath, because the breath can be very relaxing. But the sound of silence is sort of like the auditory equivalent of the perception of light. It brightens the mind. So Ajahn Amaro, when he moved to England, had decided not to lie down. There's a practice a lot of monks do where you don't lie down for a night, or I think he decided to do it for like a year. So there's a story of another nun who was in the monastery with him at Chithurst, and she kept trying to out-sit him there, but he would just sort of lean against the heater and just keep sitting, and it really frustrated her because she'd always have to leave before he did, until she realized that he just like lay there or sort of leaned against the heater all night, and she couldn't actually, win, but he was kind of sleeping against the heater anyways. So, but he's told me that he couldn't stay up for a long time because the breath just kept putting him to sleep. So he took the sound of silence as his main object, and that has been his object ever since. And if you cultivate it, then it can become unbelievably loud. You can hear it over power tools, and I know it got Ajahn Sumedho through like many board meetings. So it's a powerful object. So this is where the bright quality of the mind, and really that still, all of these emergent perceptions like light, pleasure, the sound of silence, they're all very stable and bright objects. And my experience is that, one is simultaneously keeping a very concrete, continuous tracking of the actual breath at the tip of the nose or wherever, but also keeping this sort of wide awareness, which seems to be much more associated with this perception of light and broad feeling of sukha. But at first, I've always found it very difficult to hold both in my mind at the same time. So what happens, for me at least, is the mind will expand and sort of be in this broad awareness, and then it'll suddenly contract again right to the nose, and then it'll expand and contract until after a while they kind of merge. But you should trust your mind a little bit to kind of follow. It'll find its way. With a bit of direction. So sometimes these things work like this. And the next step, and we'll stop in a second because this is a lot, but is that one trains thus, I will breathe in sensitive to the mental formations, and one trains thus, I will breathe out sensitive to mental formations. Mental formations is chitta sankhara in Pali, and it implies mental activity. So it is defined in one of the suttas, an amazing sutta, where this nun named Dhammadina sort of just schools her former husband in Dhamma. Actually, he's a non-returner, so they're both doing very well, but she's an arahant. And she talks about how the mental formations are perception and feeling. So it's as if I compare this to, we have a lot of mental perceptions going on through our days, and we orient through them. It's the sort of thoughts or the visualizations, sort of the mental landscape we built for ourselves. And we've been, in the previous 6 steps, we've been using that. We have an idea of the body, we have an idea of how the energy is moving through it. But as the mind calms down, then it's as if this sort of brightness which begins to come, this still field, is a canvas. And all the calligraphy on top of the canvas, all the writing, which is the mental activity, begins to fade. And, or rather, it doesn't fade, but one becomes very sensitive to it because that bright backdrop is becoming ever more prominent and bright, so that one can see the letters very clearly, and they seem increasingly coarse and unnecessary. And so the next step is to breathe in and out, calming the mental activity. And my sense here is that this is when one kind of lets go of a lot of the thoughts and images which one has even subconsciously been holding. And it can be very disorienting because we've almost never had a mind that calm, and frequently people can really scramble. It's as if you've stepped onto a mountain peak and suddenly you're sort of flailing around. So there's a few things which can really help, and one of them is really just to let the mind really focus continuously and take its kind of basis at the breath wherever you're finding it, and it'll just want to be there with the breath the whole time. But if you kind of let go of that too much, or the field of awareness and sort of that bright light, but if you kind of don't let it rest more in that very consciously, I find that there can be a sensation of feeling really lost, because it's so subtle. But my sense is that this is like letting all those that ride fade away and letting the canvas. Another aspect of this is these sort of, when before we have a thought, one really brilliant part of this way of cultivating breath meditation is one becomes sensitive to subtle points in the body as they manifest in knots in the body. And before a thought manifests, frequently it'll be preceded and accompanied by a physical pattern. So I find that when you get to this place, this stage, then sometimes there'll be a sense of tightness, say, in the head, and before a thought happens. And I don't know if anyone here has used trigger points, but it's where you find like a sore spot and you press it really hard and then it'll release. And I find that my mind really wants to do that with that sort of mental formation, is you let the mind go to it and clench and then it'll drop. And this is a way of kind of mitigating the thoughts before they even come up. So you're addressing the most basic mental activity below the thought before the thought actually manifests. And that's the second tetrad, which is mindfulness of feelings. So yes, the first, once again, is the 4 steps through the body. And you can really see if you're cultivating that correctly if you come out of it with a sense of refreshment. And if you're having trouble getting to that, then it is useful to experiment with visualizations. There's a few great books by Ajahn Jeff, or translated by Ajahn Jeff, called Keeping the Breath in Mind, Ajahn Nisabho, and With Each and Every Breath, which are on his website, dhammatalks.org. But cold showers are a big plus. Qigong is very helpful. And then if one moves on to that second tetrad, the second 4, around sort of watching this refreshment give rise to pleasure, give rise to brightness. And then the next tetrad has to do with the mind. And that's as if one begins to work with that canvas just on its own. But I think this is enough for now. So, yeah. So we have time for some questions, if people have some things they'd like to discuss. And Danny, if you could see if we have any comments and things. Okay. And we are live, yes. Okay.
Well, got a couple of questions. I guess the latest one is, are PT and Sukha, are they mind conditioners?
Yes, in the sense that, so mind conditioner is an interesting term. I mean, it's an English term. This term chitta sankhara, which appears later, mental formations, mental activity. Chitta means mind, and sankhara, or mind, heart, and sankhara means, oh God, it's the most complicated word apart from nibbana and dukkha in Pali. It means formation or activity, program, or in this case, I've heard Ajahn refer to mental sankhara as conditioners of the mind. So perceptions and feelings. So it's yeah, these mental qualities basically, or things that do manifest mentally. And so that can be an image, a thought, a feeling. But the interesting thing about piti and sukha, refreshment and pleasure, is that they're also really bodily based. And that's why they're sort of halfway between the body and the mind, which is why they're in the second tetrad of feeling. Because they're very visceral, but they have to do this sort of subtle energy. So they're on that sort of edge of that, but they're leading more and more towards, I'd say, the mind. And one will, I find that one feels this. It's sort of like initially your awareness is very much in your body, but as awareness brightens, you'll kind of feel that whole field of awareness kind of just bubble up and rise. And if someone isn't familiar with, say, Kundalini yoga or something, you'll know that, say, the chakras they speak of get higher and higher. So it's not an exact parallel, but yes, is sort of the question.
Okay. In the same line, then is the breath body, is it sankhara too, isn't it? And doesn't it condition the breath, conditions the body, especially early on, and then later on, the body can condition the breath. So we're talking about being conscious of breathing long, breathing short. One part I didn't hear, and I'm confused about this, but I thought that I've had trouble understanding what the capturing what I'm supposed to pay attention to with breathing short. When you getting in a state of concentration, the breath can become shallow. But I also thought that you can manipulate your body by breathing in long or breathing in short.
Mm-hmm.
If you're facing torpor, for instance, then maybe some short breaths will activate you, or long breaths will relax you. Is that in line with what you're saying here?
I think so, yeah. I'm hoping I understand the question. The breath body is another formation in the sense that the body is a formation as well. Like, it's such a broad term and it's used in different ways. But to sort of steer away from that whole convoluted realm a little bit, the idea is that yes, and the Buddha said this, name and form, like the body and the mind, condition consciousness, and consciousness conditions the body and mind, like two sheaves of reed leaning against one another. So the breath initially to calm or energize is exactly what those first two steps are for. And they're really useful in that, actually. And yeah, the ways you spoke of, say, inhaling longer to energize or something, yes, that's effective. And then, yeah, my sense is that as you sort of sink deeper and deeper into meditation, and this is why it's really helpful sometimes to begin a meditation session with like 3 really deep breaths that you just hold, and then you release it as slowly as you possibly can out through the nose. And that is really effective in calming the body. But I'd say also in pointing to after these steps to gather momentum, the mind begins to calm the body more so. I mean, we're operating more in the realm of the mind and perceptions and stuff. So the body, we're kind of operating within, but we're not actively altering our breath as much after that. Does that sort of address the question? Yeah. But also being too expedient means, sometimes you really do need to find a skillful means to kind of rarefy and refine the breath energy. So that is where qigong or going for a jog or something can be so helpful, or cold showers. Okay.
Well, I find that if I keep even the first 8 steps in mind while I'm breathing, it keeps popping me back up here. It's like such analysis, and I'm not particularly fond of that. But what I do like is when I tune into my breath and play with it a little, like Gordy was saying, okay, slow breath, what does that do? Lighter breath, I love sort of being with the breath and then seeing what it does, seeing what the fruit of it is. That, and then I can go back and say, oh, I was there. But I have a hard time keeping those steps in mind as I go, where I am. It keeps me right up here. So I don't know if there's a cheat sheet, but I just, at least I find for myself, I have to savor the breath.
Yeah.
Savor it, and then something magic happens.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Is how you work with this is helpful. Like you bring up a good point. Like if you approach this as like this is the regiment, and frequently like you don't go straight from one to the other. Like you'll pop over here and then you'll go back for a while, and the instructions are to become sensitive to the breath and your awareness is pretty much supposed to be with that object that's really calling your attention and the breath. And two objects is plenty, especially when you're getting calm. Like keeping in mind another 16 steps, or whatever. I agree. I think it's a little like having a map. Like, yeah, if you walk through the forest like this, you're going to run into stuff a lot. Much better to kind of, you sort of know the trail, especially after you've been through it a few times and you get to look around. But like you said, it's nice to be able to come back every now and again and be like, oh, okay. So that's what it's a really good point is that, yeah, if you take it as like, all right, I'm moving through here. But I think the Buddha was really laying out this sort of natural progression. And you notice there's a lot of, it does move from like more coarse and movement oriented to more and more still, more and more refined. So, but yeah, I think you got it completely right. Like trusting your intuition, and then, and that's how I've approached it as well. It's sort of like you'll practice, and then you'll suddenly realize where you were, and you'll be like, oh, I was there. But sometimes it's also helpful in giving you a little direction. Like sometimes after you've been with the breath energy for a while, it just feels stuffy in the body, and like you don't want to be there anymore. And if you let the awareness sort of move more and more towards the brightness, just that perception of light, you realize the mind has become so subtle that it wanted to go there. And then you're like, oh, that maps perfectly onto the Ānāpānasati sutta, because that's mindfulness of mind. So I really agree, though. Good point. What are your thoughts? Did that address at all where you're coming from?
Frankly, I never make it past step 8 very often.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for years.
That's the thing is, if you get to step 5 and just get like some rapture going, it's like it's enough. Like that's enough to nourish a life. It really is. I mean it. And no, I feel the same way. Like Ajahn Panyavado, a really famous teacher in our tradition, he'd be like, all right, monks, before you ordain, get an experience of deep samadhi, because as soon as you ordain, it's going to be like 5 years of just like terrible meditations, because you're sort of in the ditches, like fighting the defilements in these other ways, and you're like samadhi may just have to take a backseat for a while. And it's not always true, but it's like when people begin meditating, these peak experiences are so common of like a really refined state of meditation. You know, it's like beginner's luck or old karma or something. But then the defilements kind of catch on after you get a practice, and they block it. And that's the beauty about this sort of robust approach to breath meditation is the defilements try to block off certain ways, but there's so many ways you can play with it that usually you can find ways around them. But what's really valuable about it is that even if you aren't achieving these sort of peak experiences anymore, what you're able to cultivate, like you said, is like a really robust sense of refreshment. And that is deeply valuable.
That's always almost good enough for me.
Mm.
Like, where was I all the time when it was, and slows me right down, and I can see more clearly. I can see more clearly. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little bit about what the defilements are and what you mean by they're trying to block it?
Oh yeah, thanks, Dad. So the defilements are something we call the kilesa in sort of the Buddhist jargon, and the ones we can think of here would be greed, hatred, and delusion are the root defilements. So yeah, greed, hatred, delusion. And usually you can tell when greed or hatred come up, but there's a monk who's like, look, I see greed and hatred, but I can't tell when delusion is there. And Ajahn Chah responded by saying, you're riding a horse and asking where the horse is. And additionally, I mean, you could also think of greed and hatred as the two arms of delusion.
Oh, yeah.
So pushing and pulling away, but in a way coming from ignorance. So these are like these are the profoundly deep things that have kept us in rebirth for, depending on if you believe in rebirth, your whole life or many, many lifetimes. And yeah, but they co-opt our own intelligence. And so I think we all have experienced, like you find a great metta phrase and you're like, oh, this is the best. Like it works so well. And then after 2 days, you're like, what the heck? Like, it just stops. And it's the problem with that sort of single focus technique of, say, bringing the awareness to one point or a mantra. It's because it just doesn't work after a few days. It's just a perception, and a really simple one. But the body, if you approach it, it's like there's this huge resources here, and there's so many ways to work with it that, there's almost always a way that you
going to say, if you're talking about kind of the delusion, right? Usually when you're fabricating something, right, you don't really, that's the good or the bad or however you want to think of it, is you're fabricating it, right? And so you have to kind of leave it a little bit to recognize that it's a fabrication. Are you saying that those fabrications are usually either the greed or the hatred? They're at one or the other, and then once you've recognized it's a fabrication, and then to identify, is it the greed or the hatred, and does it fall into one of those categories, or is it something entirely else?
Do you need to repeat the question for your question?
You can't hear any questions when you're listening to a live stream.
Oh, that's good to know. Thank you.
Might want to repeat.
I will repeat that. It's very good. Let me see if I got it right, because this will help too. So when the question, I think, is speaking about delusion, when we have made fabricated a fabrication, which might mean like sort of created a mental construct or fantasy or something, do we need the only way we seem to be able to get perspective on it is if we are able to get a bit of distance from it, and then is the proper course to identify if it's a fantasy or thought based in greed or hatred, aversion or attraction, and then what's the rest of the sort of...
That was kind of the end of it, and then what do you do with it, of course. But that was really the question, is do
Okay, so do we classify a fantasy or thought as greed or hatred, and then what does one do with it? Okay, that's a good question. What do you guys think? Tommy?
I sort of a follow-up question, but I wanted to hear your answer first, I guess.
Okay. I mean, the distance is important. I mean, that's also the beauty of cultivating some measure of stillness through meditation is that's what lets you have that still reference point. Because otherwise, like if you're just in a grumpy mood, you know, every grumpy thought you have makes complete sense. Like that was even sort of the great teachers compared to stop. If usually we're shaking a bottle of oil and water, and only when we stop they separate out, and that's like the mind separating out from its aramana or like mood. So yes, that stepping back to mindfulness is really important, and when people realize how much that needs a daily meditation practice. If you want to do it really well, it really helps to have. And a meditation that's very concrete, like the breath, you know, like something we really can just put your finger on and step back. And then analyzing it, yeah, I think that is really helpful. Ajahn Chah was once asked, sort of with all of these sort of mental impressions or thoughts that come through the mind, you have to investigate every one. And Ajahn Chah said, look, it's like you're in a village and like you've seen a lot of these guys before. You don't have to stop and like have a conversation with everyone. But, you know, say you do see someone new, you know, then maybe you do want to stop and talk to them, learn their history, or say someone else is like dressed up in clothes, you know, you can be like, what's this about? So sometimes it's enough just to step back and be like, oh, this habit again. And that's enough. You know, you've been there, you've seen that movie how many times. But sometimes it is worth really investigating it even deeper and like, where does it come from? This is, you know, say a memory of trauma or something associated with that. Like bringing it up in a safe space of meditation can be a really useful way to sort of, you know, mitigate it a little bit. So yeah, I'd say looking at it in terms of its a thought in terms of if it's based in aversion or greed is really helpful. But you know, essentially what you're doing there is looking for the suffering in it, which is the first noble truth. So you're seeing the sort of coarse element in it. And that might manifest as like that subtle pull of greed or like the anger of aversion. But sometimes it might be even more subtle, especially meditation. It might just be a sense of like, this is too coarse. I want to drop it, you know? Like when you hit sort of step 8 in the Ānāpānasati, where you're calming the say that image of the body that you've been subconsciously holding that's has the energy circulating, like it's not really associated with greed or aversion, but at that point you might see that it's nonetheless it's suffering or stress in the sense like it's just too much to hold on to because the mind just wants to stop. So does that work? Okay. Yeah.
So on that, there's a question at the end of this, but first I like to ask myself what the three truths, anicca, dukkha, anatta. I mean, so recognizing the importance of that, either greed or aversion, and recognize, if I can, my ego involved in there, and that it's, and try to somehow eliminate it. But the other, or recognize it, the other part is to examine either the attractiveness of that defilement and also its evil twin. kind of like what is this bringing me? What's this resentment bringing me down?
But Gordy picked up on that theme actually by identifying attachments. You know, the things we attach to, trying to create a solid life, those are the illusions of life. And I didn't follow everything you said about the question, but I would remind us, there's a line in a book called Philosophy and Energy, very Western book, that says if a question is a predicate stated as an interrogative, so there's always there's a projection about what you want the answer to be.
That's really good.
So when you think about questions, and we think about this in Zen a lot, we just go eventually to what?
I think Ajahn Chah would always, people asked Ajahn Chah how he always knew he sort of would turn the question back on the questioner a lot. And people asked how he could always do that. And he said if they didn't know the answer already, they wouldn't be able to ask the question. So it's very good. I really like that.
There's a Buddhist idea behind that. It's just Western.
Yeah, it's really good though. Yeah, thank you. And I have to write that one down. Gordy's question was something along the lines of, after speaking to sort of how he looks at defilements that come up and letting them go by seeing them as impermanent, etc., and also the drawbacks and the attraction of them, which is something we refer to as the gratification tetrad. You see the drawback of something, the advantage of it, and then the escape. And it's important to see the advantage of it too, like what attracts us to it. Why do we like to be angry? Because only after you see that as well, why you keep going back, can you let go of it. But then the rest of the question was, oh no, Gordy, remind me really quick. I had it.
We deal with the mental formations.
Yep. Yes. Okay, so in meditation, sometimes the mind really does seem bright and clean, and yet he knows that there are these like problems and defilements kind of lurking back there. underneath the surface. So what do? Do you sort of rest in the good times, or do you look underneath the covers and try to find these things? So it's a really good question. I would say, if you're genuinely in a bright space, which is not fantasy and is squarely within the realm of the sort of meditative domain, like if you're doing this breath meditation, if it's squarely within the realm of the breath meditation and it seems really bright and you're content, truly content there, then letting yourself rest in that and watching the mind become really bright is good, and sort of nourishing and resting. The idea would be that after a time of that, it's like walking into a very bright room. It's like it takes a while for your eyes to adjust. But after you've been there for a while, you start to notice the dirt in the corners. And that'll usually be very, very subtle things, like a certain thing you're doing to keep it going. Say with that circulation of the breath energy, you might notice that you're holding this concept of the body in your mind and that it feels too coarse, so you just let it go. And that letting go allows the mind to get even brighter or more still. And this is how samatha and vipassana actually aren't separate at all. They're just work together by skimming off the dukkha, skimming off the sort of stress and unnecessary elements until it becomes more and more refined. What seems to happen is that the mind will reach sort of a limit in how bright it can get. And then it won't go anymore. It'll begin to move really actively. And that's when you can turn it. Usually the Kruba Ajahns, the good teachers, say to turn it towards investigating the body. But that's a whole nother discussion. But using a suba to like look at what this body's made of, because our attachment to it is so deep. But one can also use it to contemplate everything in one's life. But if the mind has become that still and then begins to move, that's when you can turn it towards these things. But also, like, if you do have something that's been plaguing you, like something that comes up and really has deep trauma associated with it, coming to that still point in meditation and then really consciously it into that space and bringing up the memory and letting it kind of play out in this safe environment can diffuse a trauma quite effectively, I think. I've heard people recommend that. But yeah, like if you're genuinely in a really wholesome, nourishing place that's very engaging, then letting that be is good. But if you do find yourself also kind of like wondering, oh, should I go into this? Maybe notice that, because that might be boredom. That might be a subtle aversion to it. Like if you're really engaged in a state, you're not having this sort of like, oh, is this right? Should I go here? Like, and in that case, just looking at that aversion and that boredom in itself, because that's a subtle defilement. If you find a way to move past that, then things get brighter. And yeah, don't worry about mucking around in the dirt too much. Like that stuff, we spend most of our lives there. Like enjoy, some rest, I suppose. I think we should wrap up though, for this talk or quick Q&A.